we'll continue on our topic of plastic pollution filling our oceans, what needs to happen, and we will be joined by our guest, Adeel Khan, who is a teaching fellow at SOAS and an academic writer. So please do join us after the break.
You are listening to the recording of a live show. Please do not call or text, as this is a recording, and lines are now closed.
Good morning and welcome back to today's show. This is the Voice of Islam's Saturday Morning Live. I'm Andreas Kafisas. I'm joined with Umar Batti, Qudus Mateen and Irfan Sami, and today's show is all about plastic pollution filling our oceans. What needs to happen? So on the line, we've got Mr. Adeel Khan, our guest speaker today, who's a teaching fellow at SOAS and also an academic writer. Assalamu alaikum, Adeel.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me online.
No, it's our pleasure. So today's topic is all about plastic pollution filling our oceans and what needs to happen. We've discussed some of the issues related to that. So we just wanted to know what your thoughts are on this issue.
Well, I've been listening very keenly to the broadcast over the last hour. And when you've been discussing, at least in the last half hour, when you've been discussing this question around how do we begin to think about this in terms of blame? Do we blame ourselves as parts of the consumer culture? Do we blame the corporate entities which produce things that they sell to us? That's how I've understood the conversation so far. So I'd just like to point out that as theologians, I've worked in Christian theology as well as with Muslim theologians, and as theologians, we ask much tougher questions than just at the level of culture. We ask questions when it comes to the ecological crisis. We ask questions in terms of, is it perhaps our conception of ourselves as believers, whether Christian or Muslim, which are also perhaps to blame for this current crisis. So, for example, the questions began to be asked in 1967 with the historian Lynn White, who put up a controversial theory that the origins of the ecological crisis lay in the roots of monotheistic religions. And that was very controversial because that started a whole movement of Christian theology to counter this claim, to say we can address this as believers. And that has led to all sorts of interesting productions from our Christian colleagues, including now the Pope, who is very Franciscan. And as your listeners might not know, that Saint Francis is read today as a kind of a saint of the of environmentalists. So that's where Christianity is at.
So just coming back to that point, so someone proposed, I forgot the name of is it a lady?
Lynn White.
Yeah, that the root of many of these environmental problems are from monotheistic religions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that theory and how is it what can support this theory? Because it sounds to me like the problem is around the world in terms of the environmental damage, and there's a lot happening in India and China who don't have monotheistic religions. So I was just wondering, what is there to support this claim?
So their claim, the discussions in Christian discussions were happening in the 60s, were basically around two ideas. One, that the Bible asserts man's domination and dominion over nature, which is a very anthropocentric view, which is a very human-centered view. In Islam, we sometimes see that view as that we are the khulafa of God, the representatives of God on earth. But there's a huge discussion in Islam what Khalifa means. And of course, as part of the Ahmadiyya community, we will have challenged that notion of what Khalifa might mean. There are only certain people who are worthy of calling Khalifa rather than every human being, because we do lots of terrible things. And the second idea is about Christianity making a distinction between humans as God's image and creation which has no soul or reason. Again, a very important idea at the heart of Christianity, which Muslims have huge differences from the 8th, 9th century onwards, when Muslims started to think and contemplate about this notion of, do fish have soul? Do camels have soul? Does the earth and things in the planet have soul? So these are the questions that Muslims have been asking for 1,000 years now. But the claim was that because of these two central ideas in Christianity, and because the Industrial Revolution and hence capitalism began in a Western Christian context, that has contributed to the kind of shift in thinking about humans' relation with nature in terms of exploitation. We can exploit because they don't have soul. We can exploit because we can colonize them, because we can use them for our own purposes, because they're just for our own purposes as for humans.
Those are interesting points that you make there. And I feel that probably stems from a disconnect between people and nature, for them to think that animals are just soulless, non-animate entities, when you don't have a relationship with those animals. For instance, you can have a blind person who has a guide dog, and their livelihood completely revolves around that dog guiding them. And of course, that dog is doing such a huge service. And you have dogs that save people's lives who are drowning, or you have dogs that detect, bombs through their noses, or hazardous goods, and they stop terrorist atrocities from happening. Or you have all kinds of animals doing wonderful tasks. And if you forget, if you disconnect from the service that animals provide, milk from cows and all of these wonderful things, then you start to just have this attitude that you're talking about, where you can just exploit animals, exploit nature, when you forget that we're all interconnected and they do such a service for us. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
My personal thoughts are that, there are official kind of discussions around this question of service. Animals as service providers to humans. And I've been following these discussions over the years, and there are Muslim scholars especially who talk in terms of animals are musakhar for us, which is an Arabic term in the Quran used that animals are provided for our providing service to us. There's an argument that, the way you take care of your employees, you also take care of animals because they're providing a service. So that's the kind of discussion around ethics which has been happening around human-animal relations. I would rather ask more fundamental questions, which, going back to a kind of older tradition of Muslim thought, that what is the place of animals when it comes to our understanding of God himself or God herself? How do we conceive ourselves? Do we still conceive of ourselves, humans, as a center of the universe? Or do we see ourselves as decentered, as along with animals, earth, planets, all part of God's creation and all part of God's submission? But we know that humans do not all submit to God's divine authority, or do not believe, or are not believers, or not follow an ethical guideline. But we know that animals follow laws of nature, which are made by God. So to blame our fellow brethren animals, the fish in the ocean, who are already submitted to God, is a view which I find quite challenging and attractive to have. That they are our fellow Muslims. To expand the horizon of what it means to be Muslim, submitting to God's laws, as beyond the human pale, and say all of earth and its creation are within the ambit of what we might consider of as Islam. And there's evidence in the Quran to support such claims as well.
Yeah, so I also have a question regarding how could technology come in place to help us with the current crisis?
So technology, the question of technology has been an important linkage of technology with science, and modern science has to be made clear, because technology is not neutral instruments. Technology, when it becomes separated from its ethical core, which is humans creating technology to help them survive, is different to the technology we have today, which has a logic of its own. So first of all, we have to clarify that technology is not the same thing. Tools which were made by pre-modern man and modern man are different technological tools. Once we're clear on that, then we can ask, what is the ethical basis of using such technologies today? Can we ask the ethical questions of the question of can there be rampant use of technology to as it were, study and then deploy resources to manipulate nature? And those are the kind of questions in science and religion and science and ethics which need to be asked. So technology is not just there to solve a problem which it has created itself. The rampant use of technology has led to the creation of the crisis that we are having today. So we need to, I think, ask much fundamental questions and say, what kind of ethical questions can we ask about the use of technology, rather than just say, we need technology to just fix our problem. You know what I mean?
Yes, it's a very interesting point you point out there. But in terms of that, and on this point, I want to just ask you, who should be having this discussion? Who should be having this discussion frankly in order to solve this crisis in ocean pollution?
Well, if it's just about ocean pollution, then of course the people who are responsible, authorities, environmentalists, have been campaigning for this. The point is that if we're talking from a perspective of believers, both Christian and Muslim, then we have ethical responsibilities as believers as well to side with the debate, which is much deeper than just specific problem-oriented issues. So I think we need to have a coalition across Christian and Muslims and Jewish people and other religions to say that we as believers stand firmly behind the environmentalist movement. We stand firmly behind, and our beliefs support this movement, because this is not just about personal vanity. This is not just about, am I going to live beyond my own lifetime and my children. This is about much fundamental, deeper ideas about what it means to be a believer. And I think we need to address both those things together. We need to politically and practically take part in movements and support movements which are environmentalist in our public life. And we need to ask difficult questions of our texts. What it means to be a Khalifa, a true Khalifa of God on earth. These are the kind of questions Muslims need to ask of themselves.
In terms of everyday human beings, I mean, people who are obviously not believers or who don't believe in Islam or Christianity or one of the main religions, what is your response to them, or what is your pitch to them? I mean, what should they be doing on a regular basis?
Well, the thing is, environmentalists have primarily been non-religious people. The environmentalist movement has been led by non-religious people because they have been ethically driven by their own motivations to say that it is a different type of understanding of the human which is in good relationship with our home, the earth, and its inhabitants. So it's not a problem for non-believers. Primarily, the environmentalist movements just needs to be joined by believers, I feel. You see what I'm saying? Like the history of the environmentalism has been initiated by outside religion. Religions have just had to catch up, and Muslims really need to catch up in a major way.
So, Adeel,
we're really behind.
Why do you think that there's been this lag from religious groups to join in with the environmentalist movement when you feel that there is a strong correlation between their belief set and caring for the environment? Why do you think there's been this lag?
I would, if you'd allow me, I would quote the Quran here and say that it's quite clearly in the Quran that humans are not, humans are can be angelic and good submitters to God's will and etc. But they can have potential of extreme arrogance and extreme selfishness. And this is what the humanity which is in us, I find quite disturbing, even if we're Muslim and claim to be Muslim, but we have really a vanity problem, a selfishness problem, not to be able to look beyond me and myself and my family and my friends, not to even to be able to look beyond to our communities, to our environment is a much later ethical question to ask. So it's really to look deep in ourselves and say, who am I and what is my responsibility as a believer, which I find is a problem of selfishness and arrogance. self-centeredness.
Adeel, this is Irfan. So just picking up on your point around selfishness, do you think that this is a problem driven by the society we live in today, and that this selfishness and arrogance has actually come to the forefront in the last 10, 15 years due to the competitive nature of the society we live in today?
But it's a society which is also there in Muslim societies where it's not the same type of values-driven, self-centered values-driven in those Muslim societies. So if that was the case, then we wouldn't see Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries, to be really doing poorly on indicators of environmental factors. They're doing really poorly on recycling measures. They're doing really poorly on. You saw the Indus. You just quoted earlier.
Yes.
Indus River is one of the most polluted rivers in the world. It's surrounded by Muslims. So there's something. Yeah, there's something to do with not just this society and its values around the self, but it's something much deeper to do with the fact that we deploy and use technology and science for the exploitation of our surroundings.
So Adeel, we're running out of time, but we'd just love to get any like concluding remarks that you'd like to give.
Well, there's just one thing I'd like to say, which is a expression. It's a hadith I dug up, which is related to which can be related to the ocean example. It's from Sunan al-Nasai, and it says it's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, and he says, "Whoever kills a sparrow or a bigger animal without respecting its rights to exist will be accountable to God for it on the day of judgment."
That's a lovely hadith. Thank you so much for joining us today, Adeel, and we'd love to have you again on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. So guys, that was Adeel Khan, teaching fellow from SERS, telling us a bit about the theological basis for why we're seeing these problems today, because there's this disconnect between man and his environment and what it really means to be a true believer. So he mentioned some interesting points there. He had a very nice hadith as well at the end.
I like the idea that he brought something religious into this because Voice of Islam, we're here live Saturday morning live on Voice of Islam, and it was nice to have a different perspective on this issue and also a reminder to us, our duty to the Creator of the world. Because I was just whilst he was talking, I was